sit back in your seats, get something to eat, and watch this movie. Don't let the kiddies see it, because, well, we'll let you hear the beginning first. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Left of the Projector. I am your host, Evan, back again with another film discussion from the left. Before we get into this week's discussion, I have a couple new announcements to make. The first, I have launched a Ko-Fi site where you can subscribe to the podcast or make a donation to help cover the costs of the show. You can check it out at ko-fi.com/leftoftheprojector. As well, you can also follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, as well as YouTube at Left of the Projector Pod. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. All right, we are back again this week to discuss the movie Get Out. And for this episode, I am joined by Ryan, who has a new podcast coming out called the Conscious Environment Podcast. Thank you for joining me, Ryan.
Thanks, Evan. Thanks for having me on, man.
I thought this was a good movie to start out my horror October, as I'm kind of featuring some horror movies for the month of October, as it is Halloween season, as my kids would say. It starts in the end of September. But this movie, it's been about 5 or so years since it came out. It came out in 2017, and so for anyone out there who hasn't seen it, we're not going to kind of go through a breakdown of the actual plot of the movie. But when you saw this movie again for kind of prepping for the show, what are your sort of overall maybe impressions of the movie in terms of still holding up? Because I think it holds up. I mean, it hasn't been that long. But what are your thoughts on that?
I feel like this movie ages like a fine wine. Me and my wife, we watched it this weekend. We watched it just last night. Actually, to kind of get me back in the headspace. I hadn't seen it since I think I saw it in theaters when it first came out, and then I saw it like maybe a year or two after that, and I haven't seen it since. But there's always been conversation about it, and people have always it was an instant classic. If you're into horror movies, this was like an instant classic. And I watched it again last night, and I'm like, this is even more like special than I think I remembered it was. And a lot of the themes and things to talk about are, I feel like I noticed more stuff this go around than I did even the first couple of times that I've seen the film. So I think the film definitely holds up. I think it's still poignant. And I think it's still scary as hell.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a common theme when I watch a movie. I mean, it definitely is a different feeling when you're watching a movie where you're thinking about the themes as opposed to just kind of watching it. Obviously, you're still watching it to be entertained. But I agree. I think that the themes in this movie not only hold up, but I feel like they're almost more pertinent. And, he really made a timeless classic horror movie that was pretty different and very, I don't think I'd ever seen, there aren't very many horror movies, especially directed by Black directors in general, or especially coming from a kind of a comedy background. I know Jordan Peele also was a horror fan growing up, but I think the outset of this movie, as we kind of talk through the movie, through some of these themes, is you have the kind of the common trope of any horror movie or even non-horror movie, a rom-com, where, a boyfriend is going to visit the girlfriend's parents. And I think that's the setup to this movie as they're getting ready to go out to see Chris, the main character, is going to see her parents, Rose. And so you already have sort of this instant scene where there's instantly injection of the awkwardness of, having not told her parents that her boyfriend was Black. So, I think it's from the outset, you already have, it's what you're in for.
Right, exactly. And, as a Black person who has been in interracial relationships, my wife is white. I am currently in an interracial relationship, and it's yeah, I remember having like in high school similar experiences and like these ideas, and it just like this movie personifies a lot of things. And I remember reading this interview with Daniel Kaluuya, the who plays Chris, the protagonist in the film. And later on in the movie, there's like this super awkward kind of backyard picnic party kind of thing. And he talked about how he's been to that party many times, in his life. He feels like it, what we see in the movie is the experience that a lot of Black people have, of kind of this awkwardness where people feel like they have to explain, or ask you all these, really intrusive questions because you're kind of the spectacle. And I think Jordan Peele did an amazing job kind of writing this in a way where it's, it's somewhat subtle. Like, I think it's pretty in your face with what the themes and what the point is, but in a way that I think a lot of the Black community watched this film and was like, oh yeah, this happens. This happens to us. This is how it works.
Right. And then I think on the other side, I think his intention, I think I mentioned this right before we started recording, was that Jordan Peele also wanted to replicate, or maybe not replicate is the right word, but to put on display, I think, to the white audience, like myself, of this is how that experience is for, someone who's Black maybe at a party where it's predominantly white. It was to make you feel uncomfortable. And I think he succeeds in that sense, of the movie. And I think one of the other, that we'll probably mention it too, but this is I wrote down a couple quotes as I watched the movie. And one is very early, again, in the scene before they embark on their trip to, I think it's upstate New York. I assume they don't say exactly, but the girlfriend Rose tells Chris that, oh, quote, my dad would have voted for Obama a third time. And it comes into play a little later when he actually says this, the father. So I feel like it's this, the white character trying to, be buddy, or to kind of have something in common that they don't necessarily feel or have. I don't know if that's how you saw, or.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think I wrote down in my notes here, liberalism versus leftists.
Yeah.
And I think that's definitely, that's the frightening character. And I think that's, for like, it's a Black horror film for sure. But like you said, I think the point was kind of to show a mirror up to white liberals, to be like, hey, you're kind of scary.
Like, yeah, that's the other part of the horror, I guess.
Right, is, it's horrifying, and you have this kind of false awkwardness. Like, you feel uncomfortable watching these characters just be so awkward, like the secondhand embarrassment. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yes, that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah, like you're watching the Armitage family and you're like, oh, they're so, like, they're insufferable. Like, and something I was thinking about the whole time. So Allison Williams, who I think she's Marnie on Girls. I never really watched Girls, but if you're listening to that character, and she plays Rose, Chris's girlfriend, and I feel like I have dated this girl. Like, all these passive aggressive, it's not straight up gaslighting kind of thing, but she just downplays all of his feelings. And I think a lot of kind of white liberalism, it ends up being that, where it's choosing peace over confronting like a genuine concern. Because Chris's concerns aren't, insane. He doesn't make a wild claim throughout basically the entire film, but he just keeps pointing out things that are weird. His phone gets unplugged. He thinks the mother hypnotized him, and she downplays all of it. I mean, right from the start, like if you just want to just jump right to the beginning, because I was thinking of the song that plays right when those two characters are introduced.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this song by Childish Gambino, and it's this very like Shakespearean storytelling because it's stay woke, ends creeping, don't close your eyes, too late. And the lyrics are like foreshadowing what is going to happen in the rest of the movie. And it's a very specific kind of needle drop, like right on that part of the chorus, because that's not really what the song is about. But they chose this part of the chorus that just kind of is almost talking to Chris. So you're getting all these themes in your head. This stay woke, they're creeping on you. Don't close your eyes, or it'll be too late. And then, you watch the rest of the movie and you go, oh, that's what they were talking about.
Yeah. No, well, in general, the soundtrack of this movie, since you mentioned it, is very good and very well crafted. And since you mentioned the song, I think the one thing that we kind of quickly skipped over was when, what's his name? The actor, Lakeith Stanfield, who plays Andre, is abducted at the very beginning of the movie. And I think the song that's playing is Rabbit Run, which is also, I felt like a perfect song. That's not the name of the song, though.
No, I think it is. It's like Run. I think it's Run Rabbit Run is the name of the song.
Yeah, and I felt like in that too was it felt like the right song. And I think the next scene that I think is worth discussing before we get to the house, which I had a couple notes about, was when they're driving there, they hit the deer on the way up, Rose, and Chris. And then the cop comes and he's asking Chris for his ID. And he doesn't want to give it to her. And Allison, again, I keep saying Allison, Rose, is, kind of standing up for him. And the thought that I had in my head was she has the ability to stand up to the cop and kind of be mean to him or demand that Chris not have to show his ID because she is white. And so she can, be that person that, Chris is just trying to go along, give him his ID, move along. Again, it feels also like a specific moment that probably lots of people have experienced.
Yeah, for sure. Like I remember I remember when I first watched it having the same exact reaction that Chris does in the film, where he's like, "Yeah, I'll just give him the ID because and he even says to Rose like, babe, it's okay. It's fine. Just let it go. And she doubles down and eventually the cop backs off. But I do think it's like kind of interesting, like jumping ahead a little bit in the story, kind of looking back on it with 2020 vision. It's also her getting rid of a paper trail. Chris is disappearing into the cops can't have his name on file somewhere.
That's a good call. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I feel like it's I guess it has a double meaning in a sense.
Yeah, and I feel like we're gonna run into that a lot with the way that Jordan Peele is writing this film. I think it's why it's so universal for a lot of people. Is a lot of the things are scary on their face for two different reasons. Like the racial aspect makes it scary for a certain person, but then when you kind of squint at it and you're like, oh yeah, it's a horror movie. Like the line I wrote down that's right before this is he's talking to Little Ray Howie, which is one of my favorite characters, the TSA agent, Rod, his best friend. Rod. He's talking to Rod, and Rod just says to him, like, my advice, don't go to white girl's parents' house. And they're laughing, and he finally gets off the phone, and you're kind of having this moment of like, oh yeah, is this gonna be, is this a thriller, or like, is it a horror movie? Kind of, you take a step back a little bit from it, and then they immediately hit that deer with a giant jump scare. And it's like, oh yeah, that's right. This is a horror movie. Like Jordan Peele knows what he's doing. Like it's a horror movie.
Yes.
Yeah, there's gonna be jump scares. It's gonna they're supposed to freak you out. And then I think the very next scene we're at the house.
Yes, that's right. And so the you know the I think this is where you start to kind of or get to sort of one of the themes that I noticed in this movie, and actually what brought it to mind even before. I think I saw a video you had posted online about sort of overt versus covert racism, and that I sort of was watching this movie from that perspective. I mean, not my personal perspective, but just from the interactions in the movie. And I think once they get to the house and they start interacting, Chris interacts with the mother and the father, and then the people who work at the house, which we obviously learn what they are later. But there is constant sort of this covert, I think, racism that begins to occur even prior to that party you mentioned earlier and some of the other instances. I feel like that plays a big role, throughout the movie.
Yeah, we're starting to get into the Dean Armitage's kind of my man talk, which Rose makes a comment about in a later scene, but you get that feeling, and I think this is part of the really smart writing on Jordan's part. For a lot of black people, and even kind of anecdotal from myself, I've met that man before, like as in that character. I've met that dad before, who, we're not going to say anything about race, but just so you know that he doesn't care about race, he's going to let you know how much he doesn't care about race. And it's not that big of a deal. And how you know it's not a big deal is because he told you. And it's like, you're the only one talking about race this entire time.
Yeah.
And so it's like those little comments, the my man, and it's in the trailer, but that really cringy scene where he's staring at them on the couch and he goes, "So how long has this thing been going on?" And you're like, "Ugh, stop! Why? Please stop talking like that, man."
I mean, he may as well have just been like, I feel like all of those kind of things he's saying to him would have, been summed up by him being like, "Oh, I don't see color." I feel like that's like the line he was trying to impress upon it by saying, like, I'm not racist because I'm saying all these things that means I'm not.
Yeah, and I feel like it's even like almost more insidious, because this is kind of the white liberal take, where they're beyond the I don't see color thing, because that's almost universally seen as like kind of like a racist dog whistle.
Right.
And it's funny because like this movie came out in 2017. He wrote this during the Obama years, but it feels almost more poignant in 2022.
Right.
But kind of this idea of, we're not going to say I don't see color, because he wouldn't have made the comment about Obama. Like, he sees color and he quote unquote appreciates it, but it's almost like that person's more dangerous, because like blackness is a commodity. And something I noted when he's giving the tour, he talks about all the different countries that he's been to and how he's a traveler and how he always has to come back with a souvenir. I wrote that down. I always have to come back with a souvenir. And it's like, he acknowledges that he's in a different country. He acknowledges that he's interacting with a different culture that's probably black or brown. I forget what country he says off the top of my head, but he acknowledges all of that stuff. Like, so he acts as though he's appreciative of the culture, and that's what he wants to do. But ultimately, we realize that that's not going to be the case. But it's almost like the people who are too zealous are almost, or like, scarier.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think he even mentions when he's talking about the a souvenir. He says, the line he says, it's such a privilege to be able to experience another person's culture. Know what I'm saying? So he's trying to say, like, oh yeah, I can see where you are from, like where you're coming from as not a white American. And then he goes into the Berlin Olympics and Jesse Owens and his dad. I feel like that whole scene is just truly, it's kind of off the rails.
Yeah, and I like the little line. Like this is I had to pause the movie because it was just like rapid fire, like just line after line after line that I think you got to watch this movie twice at least to feel like, oh man, this is crazy. Because um they walk past the basement door and he says, we're not going down there because we've discovered some black mold down there, so we keep that part of the basement locked away. But it's, again, later you're like, oh, black molds, oh, I get it.
Yeah,
And
that
then when he talks about his mother and saying how she loved the kitchen, and this is kind of a little bit of movie magic kind of storytelling, right? Like just cues from it being a literal film. So he says, they're walking into the hallway. He's walking towards the kitchen down the hallway, and he says, the kitchen was my mother's favorite place, so we keep a little piece of her in there. And it's a hard cut to Georgina's like insane plastic smile standing in the kitchen. And that's like, oh, that's the little part of his mother. They do keep a little part of his mother in there.
yeah, like in the first watching, you don't like when you the first time you saw the movie, those aren't, maybe in retrospect you notice those things, but when you rewatch them, especially, I noticed that part too, and there's lots of nods to like the little horror aspects that we haven't really gotten to yet. Just like any good horror movie, you have that 45 minutes of build up of a little bit of humor, a little bit of awkwardness, and then you kind of get into the things are getting weird, which is I think where we're kind of headed. And Chris starts noticing things are different, and you mentioned before, like his phone gets unplugged and all of these different pieces. And then you kind of have Rose sort of gaslighting him and telling him things that aren't happening. So I think you mentioned gaslighting before, kind of from earlier in the film, but is that kind of throughout the entire movie until sort of Chris uncovers he's actually becomes a prisoner? He's captured and he's in the basement. Is that how you saw all of the characters, sort of primarily Rose, but kind of gaslighting him? And especially given the fact that we know that she's leading him on the whole time. So it almost makes it even worse because it's all an act.
Yeah. So her like heel turn at the end, I think I wanted to see it coming, but it still kind of like was a gut punch because her character is very good. Like she almost gaslights the audience in the
Yep.
same way of having this completely ignorant view of the world, like this very innocent white privilegey kind of view of the world where everything Chris does, and I guess where it's gaslighting is everything Chris says and everything Chris does is he's exaggerating. He's exaggerating and it's all going to be okay. Don't worry about it. And that's, kind of when Jordan Peele says his favorite movie and what did kind of inspire him a little bit was Rosemary's Baby.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely, you can feel that where everybody around him seems to be telling Chris that like it's gonna be okay. And all of these things, like kind of getting back to overt versus covert racism, all of these kind of covert microaggressive racist things also intermingled with horror movie tropes. Like, he's completely secluded. The nearest neighbor is across the lake. They keep unplugging his cell phone, just little things like that. But when he brings it up, she just tells him everything's going to be okay. He's fine. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Until he starts to believe that, like, maybe it's fine. Like, I guess I'm okay. Like, nothing bad has happened. And that is what racial gaslighting is, and what it feels like is nothing too quote unquote bad has happened yet in order for you to feel justified in your outrage.
But I guess that's sort of when I think of it sort of in real life, it's sort of you're able to be, tricked or, go along with something you may not want to because of all the gaslighting. You kind of just, it wears on you, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been like kinds of lots of studies kind of about this sort of PTSD almost, like racial gaslighting leading to like a sort of PTSD where you're back in those situations and you've been so conditioned to having to have a bigger reaction that you end up like kind of freaking out like a little bit. So in our world and in our reality, they have been studying like how much this kind of wears on people and like what the like dealing with racism all the time, like what the physical problems are. But I think I think the next scene kind of starts to pit those two ideas of covert versus overt together, like against each other. Is I think it's the dinner scene where the brother
God.
comes.
Yes.
Oh man, what did you think about that scene? Like the brother's he's going crazy.
Yeah, yeah. I think his name is Jeremy. Yeah,
Yeah.
that scene was. I almost feel like that scene is more uncomfortable watching. I mean, especially maybe as a white person watching that, as it's so cringy, almost more so than the party that's I think the next day, where there's all those very uncomfortable old people saying things. And I think why I see it that way is when it came to the party. I mean, kind of obviously the undertones of all this is we know the motive behind everyone at the party. Whereas at the dinner, I think it's just the people there being themselves. Jeremy is being what he is. And it was super uncomfortable. I think he was showing his own inadequacies to
Mm-hmm.
himself as, because he was trying to compare himself to Chris as, being stronger and playing sports and all these different things. And it was very cringy is just kind of the only word that pops to my mind when I watch that part.
Yeah, and I think that is kind of begins, I think like the thesis of the film is the black body as a commodity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you want to get into like a little Karl Marx like fetishization and like the issue of the commodification of things that shouldn't be commodities, that's where he's coming from, and that's why Chris feels so uncomfortable and you feel uncomfortable watching that scene because he's talking about him like you would talk about it, like any other just object, and like we're watching a man objectify another man for the sole purpose of like fighting at this point, but it doesn't. It just feels like this kind of gross display of like, yeah, you're like nothing about you, but just your genetic. What does he say? I think it's your genetic makeup. If you pushed yourself, you would be a beast, and it's like, ew. Like, I don't want to be an animal. Like I don't need to be a beast. You know. Um.
And it really is hard to ignore that they're using his body literally as that commodity because as we see in I don't know 20-30 minutes left later in the movie when there's literally just an auction which they call bingo for them to bid on him as an actual commodity.
Yeah. Exactly. So we run through this awful party of them trying to figure out which aspects of him that they do enjoy, and yeah, that's where it just is overt racism the entire like the entire time. Like it starts off slow with the Tiger Woods thing, but like the sexualizing thing with the older woman where she's like she turns the rose and she goes, is it is it true what they say? And it's like, ugh.
Yeah.
But I think one of the most frightening, like as far as like a horror movie kind of goes, like I think one of the most frightening parts of that series of scenes is when Chris goes upstairs to, I think he's trying to call Rod again, or he goes to check his phone.
Right.
Something. He goes to get his phone. But it's like as soon as he leaves, everybody stops talking and they just stare.
Oh, so
And
awkward.
that scene still gives me the creeps because it was like the confirmation to the audience that like, yeah, this is weird. It's just as weird as you think it is, and maybe even weirder.
Yeah, I was gonna
Like
say it's weird, more weird.
Something is happening because this party isn't a party. It's an interview. They're looking to like they're trying. This is all about him, and if he's not there, there is no party.
Yep, that's the word I wrote down was interview.
Yeah.
I mean, it literally is. They're basically sizing him up. So, you know, he like gives one guy a handshake, and he's like, "Oh, it's a firm handshake." And I think that the one scene I think amongst the party that was probably the most awkward. I think there's an Asian. They don't say whether he's Chinese or an Asian man, and I feel like it's super. I feel like that was like the most overt racist part of that among all the other aspects of that. And I think there's also the mention of like black being back in style.
That I wrote that line down.
Which also was super.
Black is
that what he says?
Black is back in style, and it's like, ugh.
Yeah, that entire scene, and I think what makes it even brings back the gaslighting is I feel like Rose sort of had warned him prior to the party, like, oh, it's going to be super awkward, to kind of prepare him. But she doesn't really, and I think this is the end. Like he leaves the party because it's so ridiculous, and they are talking while they're having the auction part, and it seems like she's trying to kind of bring him back in and like not let him leave because he can't leave, or all of this would have been for naught. All of her hard work to convince him that she loves him or whatever.
Yeah, but that happens right after he tries to take the picture for Rob.
Oh, right. Yes.
Because he comes down with his, and that's the trailer. That's the moment that made people want to get out and watch the movie. Is he's there and he tries to take a sneak picture of the guy Logan, which is Lakeith Stanfield, that we eventually see later. Lakeith Stanfield is now this completely different person. He was Andre, but now he's Logan, this guy in this linen suit with this straw hat on. He looks ridiculous. And he, while he's talking, he goes to take a picture of him so he could send it to Rod, and this flash goes off. And whatever that does interrupts their hypnosis, which we didn't even get to the sunken place. That was a scene or two back. The sunken place with like the hypnosis, but apparently snaps them out of it is a bright flash of light, and that's where he charges them, and he's get out, get out, get out, get out. And that's this terrifying moment too of like, whoa, what is what is happening feeling that they give the audience the entire time is like just masterclass with. We feel so much so in his shoes, almost the entire film. We are just distraught by like what is happening to Chris, and then they end up going to the lake while they're having the auction. And I think it's interesting. I don't know if you clocked this, but the guy that ends up buying him. Is that how we have to say it? But the guy that ends up getting Chris, he is blind. He's a blind art dealer, and he keeps talking about wanting his eye, which even the first time I saw the movie, I was like, that doesn't make sense, right? Like, we got to know that doesn't make any sense because his quote unquote eye isn't literally his eyes. right? Like we know that, like we
Yeah.
you need his brain, like the way that he views the world. It's not because of his physical eyeballs, like right. So if
Right.
this
Yeah.
guy was a amateur photographer or semi-pro photographer and he never made it, so he went into art dealing, dude, this isn't gonna work either. You're never gonna make it.
I mean, obviously, any good horror movie starts to give you those little painted little notes, and I think the scene you were talking about before with Andre or Logan is that it's now that same person from that opening scene, but you're trying to figure out in your head. I think at this point, I'm trying to think back to when I hadn't seeing it for the first time. Is I kind of had the idea that they were hypnotizing people to do things for them. You don't know how deep this plot goes. And I think until the scene you just mentioned, I think it's Jim who owns like Hudson Galleries, I think is what
Yeah,
it's called.
yeah. Hudson art dealers.
100 Art. Yes, that's right. So I think that sort of like is the turning point where at that moment that he is going to win the auction, I think. I mean, again, it's hard to put yourself back to the moment you saw it the first time, but at that scene, you know what's going to happen at the auction.
Right, yeah. Like as soon as you can tell like that it's an auction, it's like okay, well, yeah, this guy they showed us this guy so that we could know that he's going to purchase him. But this is honestly something that I brought up with my wife last night, and I was trying to articulate it so I could talk to you about it today. But thinking about this idea that it like there is a certain level of kind of like class, the capital that is happening here. Like they're so rich. Like we never know how rich the Armitages are or any of the people that they are, but we know that they're so rich that they have surpassed usual commodities. Like they don't show us a boat, they don't show us any fancy cars, like more than like the bad guy lineup of like black SUVs. We see that,
Yeah.
but we don't see any sports cars. Even Jeremy, he has like an older sports car, but it's not like an insane car.
No, it's not like a
Um,
Ferrari or something. It's like a
right? Yeah,
vintage
he doesn't.
Porsche.
Yeah, it's it's a nice car from it's a vintage car. It's probably great. But we don't get any of the usual commodities. Like their house is very nice. It's huge, but the furniture is modest. It doesn't have like a big blown out like modern look to it or anything like that. It's not open floor plan or anything. It's just like a big house that looks like it has a bunch of additions on it and it's on a bunch of land. But the way that we know that they're rich, and I think I don't know if you clock this either, but we don't know how much they pay. Or like we can't tell how much.
No, they say 30, I feel like. And I just assumed, I guess they don't really say what that represented. I mean, it had to have been, or maybe it was three, or I don't know. I would just assume that it was in the millions, considering.
Right. Yeah. Kind of, just hoping it's not $30,000. Is that what a person's worth? But I think it's just kind of an interesting observation on, class too. Like we get to this point where human beings aren't human beings anymore. They're just another form of commodity. And you get this when now we're in the basement. Um, Chris has figured out that it's a ruse. He's figured out that Rose is in on it and he gets knocked out again with the teacup thing. And now he wakes up in the basement. They have the TV of exposition and then the guy, the blind art dealer gets back on the TV and it's a two-way thing and he's able to talk to him. And he ends that off by saying, "Don't lump me in with them. I don't care about your race." That's not what I'm doing it for. Some people do it to feel stronger, to feel better, to feel sexier, to feel all these things. But that's not what I want. What I want is deeper. What I want is that I, man. And then they just kind of stares at each other. And then he says, you know what, I'm done here. But I think that's such an interesting, almost more frightening thing because everybody else is doing it because of racism. But that guy, he's doing it because he's rich and he can.
But this came to me when you were talking about the basement. I feel like the basement is actually nicer and more upscale, has a pool table in the room he's in, than the upstairs part of the house. And then the thing that I was going to mention before I just thought of that was it feels very much like the auction and the whole, almost richer than everyone else, and they don't even have to show it. It has a very, slavery kind of vibe to it. They're literally auctioning off a black man for his body. I don't know how much of I don't feel like it's much of a stretch.
Yeah, it's pretty on the nose. Yeah. I like that they almost use like a funeral type portrait of him. Like it kind of gave very much so that vibe of like Chris, like he's they with the device they explain to us that he doesn't die, but like his life will effectively be over. I thought that was pretty good imagery with that, with the big giant picture of him right next to it.
Right.
And the other thing too, I think, that Jordan Peele does a good job priming us for this the whole time, because the entire time Rod is continuously talking about how like they're going to be sex slaves. And I think that's why when I first saw the movie, I was like, oh, they're just like hypnotized. And then I guess it's all spoilers, right?
Yeah, no, don't worry about that.
And then we find out that no, they're actually transplanting parts of the white guy's brain into the black guy's brain and keeping motor functions or whatever. They're going to be in the sunken place the entire time. And the other guy's going to be driving, but it's a brain transplant. Like it's this wild science fiction, like body horror kind of thing.
And I think you mentioned Rod. I think what also I think is like that Jordan Peele really hits on all like the perfect horror tropes, but not in like a recycled way. Rod goes to the police to try and tell them about like the sex slave aspect of it, and they at first you think they're going to take it seriously, and then they just laugh at him. Which is, I feel like it's a common thing you see in horror movie where you're trying to tell someone like that there are all these zombies or whatever it is, and like, oh, haha, sure there are. And then, of course, he ends up being right, almost right.
Yeah, that's what I thought was really interesting about Rod's character, because in any other film, Rod's character would be wrong. He's the comedic relief kind of thing that's supposed to come in and be, levity for us. And he would be outlandish and be incorrect, but he's right the whole time.
He warns him at the beginning, as you said, in the car. He says, like, don't go to that person's house.
Yeah, right. He said, don't go in their house. And then at the end, a perfect bookend where he's now in person with him in the car talking to him. And the first thing he says out of his mouth is, I told you not to go into their house. But I think I was going to say something I clocked too that I really liked is they foreshadowed a lot of ways to harm for him to end up, quote unquote, defeating the bad guys. Like he plugs his ears with cotton that he pulls out of the chair. It's a very poignant kind of moment that he pulls out of this leather chair that he just keeps gnawing at, kind of just scratching at it until he's able to get that out. But I don't know if you noticed, but he ends up killing all of them with almost decidedly markers of like affluence.
Yeah.
Like the mounted deer, he kills Dean with that. It knocks over an expensive looking, fancy candle that sets fire to the house. The bocce ball that he uses, which I will stand on this. Jeremy should have been dead. Like, I, I love a good jump scare. I love them coming back. It's a horror movie. I get it. But we have to stop pretending that people can get knocked out and not be different when they wake up later.
Yeah, yeah. No, that was one of those moments. Obviously, in the first time you see it, you don't know that's going to happen. But again, I think that's another instance where Jordan Peele perfectly brings in that, like you said, jump scare, person you think is dead. I mean, that literally Halloween franchise has made 15 movies based on that premise.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then another thing I clocked too with kind of the show of affluence and that being almost one of the villains is it looks as though Rose, when she changes out of her New York City girl look into her home Armitage look, she almost looks like she's wearing like riding gear.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that. Yeah.
And my wife would be so mad at me if I didn't bring this up. She's eating Fruit Loops, dry Fruit Loops, and drinking milk out of a straw like a psychopath.
Well, the one thing that I was talking to a friend about this movie before I rewatched it, and she was kind of pointing out that I feel like Allison Williams' character, Rose, the entire movie, I feel like she slowly becomes more kind of, I don't want to say like just crazy. It seems like not the best way to describe it, but she does transform slowly throughout the movie.
Yeah, and I was actually just I can't remember where I heard this from. I think it was another podcast I was listening to, kind of talking about this idea. And they were saying it's not that it changes to something different. She was something different, and this is the real her.
Like it's being
And
revealed.
like you can see it when she has the phone call with Rod. He calls and she answers the phone, and they keep cutting back between Rod and her, and she is just stone faced, but completely acting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's just, yeah, it's a really wild thing. Yeah, to see it, so jarring and really disturbing.
Yeah.
Oh, something else I wanted to mention, I want to think to say is when they go to when he's watching the little video about the coagula, the science fiction thing that they end it with "a mind is a terrible thing to waste."
I wrote that down too.
And that was a commercial from the United Negro College Fund to inner city youth about going to college. And it's such a clever, just kind of another little nudge that, like, yeah, we know that we're doing this to Black people, and we know what and why we're doing this, and it's on purpose by design.
Yeah, but it's almost like they need them, they need their bodies, their labor. And so, they need them to continue going through the system so that that's available for, rich people who are beyond commodities, and now they're literally just trafficking people again.
Right. Yeah. They're just completely beyond everything. I just think it's such an interesting kind of also little stab at classism that, like, they're so beyond just normal stuff that they have to figure something else out, like to buy people, to buy bodies. Because I always think something interesting with like science fiction and things like that is not necessarily the end result, but like the technology in itself. Like, this technology, it is amazing, and they could have done it with anything. They could have put their bodies in robots and lived forever, but that's not the point. Like, the point is to be racist at some line. They kind of get down to that's what it is. And I think that is perfectly kind of bookend with the red and blue lights at the end of the film, just kind of feeling like, man, like no matter what he's going through, this is probably one of the scarier moments. Like, I I remember when I was in the theater, like the whole room made a sad sound.
Yeah.
Like everybody went, "Oh no!" Like when the police lights come on at the very end, and then they open, Rod opens the door and it says airport on the side of it, and you're like, "Wait a second, wait, who is that?" And then it's him, and my theater almost stood up and cheered.
it was a perfect, because there are lots of horror movies where it would end, with that moment where there isn't like that sense of release. Whereas in this, you do get that, that feeling. There was actually one line I wrote down, or actually maybe before that, I was going to say, is I think the other aspect of the technology you mentioned, all of the people, the grandmother, the grandfather who are in these people are working it, they could have had them. I don't know why I feel like them being out and actually doing chores was almost like they had to have them on display for that was the rich, fancy, that was the object that people come to their house and see, right? All that whole procession of all the people coming to their house. They didn't have like a crystal, vase or some fancy, rug. That was their possession. That was better than everyone else's.
Yeah, exactly. And touching back on, this is slavery with extra steps, but yeah, how is that not the same thing that at that time that would have been your big commodity, would have been like, I have these people that work for me. Don't you want people that work for you?
Right.
Or like I'm able to. And I think it's very interesting too that Dean, or maybe that's the plan, but like they haven't changed themselves or anything. You know what I mean? Like they're still holding on to their whiteness and their roles. Like Allison Rose's character or Jeremy's character, like even though Jeremy seems like he really wants to be, he isn't in a black body. Why not? They're the ones doing all the work. It's they don't have to quote unquote pay for anything because they do the labor themselves on that part. Why isn't he part of that? But I think it's because he's not supposed to, it's more beneficial in the position where he's at right now than he would want to be at some, at some other time.
Right.
He still doesn't, he wants our rhythm, not our blues. He still doesn't want to be black, but he wants all the cool things that come along with it.
Right. And like the Dean and Missy are essentially, I mean, I was kind of in my head also thinking about how they've convinced their own children to act this way. Because Rose has been doing this. She had that little trophy box like a serial killer, in her room, which is what I think tipped Chris off at the very end as to what was going on, because she had said she never dated a black person before, and obviously was a lie. So they've been doing this for years and years, presumably all the time, but there are only two people at their house. There's the grandfather and the grandmother, and then the Lakeith Stanfield's character. So, but presumably if they have this video they're doing and all this, there's lots of other people out there that they've done this to.
Right, yeah, because I think there's something in that back shot. I think there's like 12 people, because in the scene that I was referring to earlier where she's eating the Fruit Loops and drinking the milk, behind her, because she's sitting on her bed again, behind her on the wall, which they weren't there before, are the framed pictures of her and all of the different black people that she's been with. Yeah, exactly. They're trophies because it's like she's a serial killer. But yeah, exactly. was she always like that? I mean, I guess, you would be raised in that flashback kind of thing, that commercial for this product. She's a little girl. So she was literally raised thinking that this is what you were supposed to do. This is what you were supposed to be. And yeah, that's okay and good and fine.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be any different to, if you were the children of a slave owner or something like that. That's just, that's what we do to keep our wealth, keep my privilege, keep whatever it is. So, yeah, it's I didn't notice the Fruit Loop. I did notice she was drinking milk, but the scene with the pictures behind her, it presumably is like another, like her other bedroom that somehow Chris didn't see, which they don't really. That's also strange.
Oh, I think it's the same bedroom, but she put the pictures up.
Oh, okay.
Like
okay.
all those pictures get taken down because he notices, like he clocks that little room, and because the doors open earlier in the movie and then
Yeah.
it's closed for the rest of the movie until the very end. And he clocks that it's there in the beginning, but he doesn't go in it. And I think it was her running in and taking everything down or making sure that it was all set and then putting all that stuff away. And then later she opens it back up because tonight's the night. It doesn't matter what happens. He could find it. It doesn't make a difference.
Right.
Because they're well past. They've already sold him. They're kidnapping him. He's gone. Chris is gone.
There's maybe a couple moments in like the final scene that I thought there's little notes that I wrote down is or maybe it was right before that when they're leaving the house. I think either Dean or Missy says to Chris that he was Rose's favorite, which almost tries to inject like some level of humanity into her as not being the psychopathic person who's luring black men, but at the same time, I don't think it's enough to succeed in that. I don't know if you caught that line.
So I wrote that down too, and I clocked it as something else. She doesn't say you're my favorite, and because I rewound it twice so I could be positive. She says you were one of my favorites, and I know it's a small distinction, but one of just it's the moment that you would have expected her to say you were my favorite, right. and it be like a lie, and you're like, oh yeah. But her almost saying like you were one of my favorites almost adds like an extra layer of like kind of insidious truth to it. Like
yeah.
Like, yeah, you were one of the people that I enjoyed the most of doing this thing. I don't actually like any of you though. But out of everybody, you're one of the few people that I enjoyed more than the other people. And it just, I thought that like almost separated her even more into like this kind of, psychopathic kind of zero empathy thing. Like,
yeah,
it's just a job to her, but
right. Yeah.
No, I guess they never explain. They never explain why she does it like that, and Jeremy just straight up kidnaps people.
Right. It's like I think that almost makes her more to just kidnap someone. Like, yeah, that's horrible to do, but to lure someone, get into a relationship with them, bring them out to your parents, like that is psychopathic.
Yeah, because I think they say it's 5 months in the beginning of the film.
Yep, they do.
Like that's insane to me. Like she would just, I don't know, just do all that.
I don't know how. I think I noticed this before, but you mentioned that Jordan Peele's favorite movie is Rosemary's Baby, so it makes perfect sense that he would name the character Rose, of course.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a bunch of nods to other, earlier horror films and things like that. And
yeah.
This is his, psychological thriller, scariness.
Yeah.
And I think Us is probably his more straight up slasher horror.
Yes, more gory film. For sure.
Yeah, this is. Yeah, there's a kill count on this would be pretty boring because you have almost 85 minutes of movie, 90 minutes of movie, and then you got 10 minutes of just insane kills. You have like the mother going to stab him with the letter opener, and he just puts his hand up, and the knife goes right through his hand, and he doesn't move because he's just gone. He's on I'm going to fight all of these people mode.
The moment where Rose is left behind and you presumably alive, but sort of like the sole survivor, I feel like is also kind of like a good, I wouldn't say common, but someone survives the carnage. But in this case, you kind of don't want her to because she was the perpetrator of it. Whereas in the other case, it'd be, like there's one sole survivor of the murderer. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. They kind of flipped the script on the final girl trope. And
Exactly,
in another
yes.
movie, that would be Rose would be the final girl that got saved and made it out. But nope, she gets shot, and it cuts to her like kind of what we think she dies. Like I think that world is pretty done. But that was kind of a meta view, but I think is something pretty brave that Jordan Peele has been doing in his films is explaining everything. So like as far as like what the horror element of it actually is, he does a
Yeah.
good job like explaining like what the horror is, and then being done. Like the movie doesn't lead you to be like, oh, well, something else is coming down the pipe. It just nope, it ended.
It
The
removes the
movie's
sequel
over.
possibility kind of aspect to it.
Yeah, and I like that these movies, this movie is self-contained. It's just this is it, start to finish. This is the story I want to tell, and we're out of here.
Yeah, I agree. I watched this new movie. I think came out a few months ago. The movie X, which I would recommend.
Oh, I loved X.
I hadn't seen it yet. I saw it last 2 nights ago, and that's like the opposite. Where I don't want to ruin. Well, I'm not going to ruin the end, but it has an ambiguous ending. So and then there is a sequel. So I guess it's a prequel technically.
Yeah, I
which
guess
I'm very excited for.
It's a prequel, but yeah, that movie definitely does that is
The
as
final
well,
girl
kind of
trope.
right? Yeah, exactly. With that same thing. But yeah, did we do it? Did we do it? Did we miss anything?
I don't think so. Yeah, I was just gonna say if you had any last either things we missed or just any last parting thoughts.
No, not really. I think we covered it pretty well. The only thing I just wanted to, I guess, hammer home, and I just did a video on this too, like talking about that Dahmer series.
Oh yeah,
But
I saw that. It was really good.
yeah, the commodification of the black body, I believe, is such a terrifying terrifying proposition to BIPOC people. But it's oftentimes we forget about kind of this laid back group of people that are seemingly okay with it. And I think that's like kind of where the real horror is everybody is doing horrifying things in this film, like directly to Chris, but I think a lot of the scarier people are like the 12 people that just left that party. Like what did they do?
Right.
Like who are those people? And I think a lot of what he did with this movie is kind of like just get in your head about things, about always not looking over your shoulder, but taking something that seems normal or maybe even a little awkward, but making it fairly scary. And I guess I'll leave you with this. So when I went to go see the film with my new wife at the time, who had only been married about a year, we went to go see the movie and had a blast. It was an amazing experience in theaters. And then we're walking out of the movie, and she goes to hold my hand, and we're walking out with a big crowd of a mix of people, mostly black people, but there's white people that had seen the film too, but she goes to hold my hand, and I don't know how like visible we were to a big group, but I jokingly snatched my hand away from her and turned to her and kind of laughed, and I go, I don't know, you might be walking home. We just all watched the same movie, and everybody in the room just started laughing really, really, really hard, like a interracial relationship. Just had a funny moment watching Get Out and being actually really scared of each other at the end of the movie. But I just always think of that kind of funny moment where you get to leave a theater and everybody's like on the same page, like with the movie. It's a cool thing.
A good way to put it. But yeah, I think I don't really have any other thoughts on the movie. I think we did a good job. But again, Ryan, thank you for joining me. And you can check out your new podcast, which comes out. Does it come out tomorrow? What's the date that
it comes out? October 4th. It'll be on Spotify and Apple Music and all that. Think of a place, it'll be there. Wherever you're listening to this right now, it'll be there.
Yes, that's great. But Ryan, thank you for joining me, and appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
All right, well, thanks everyone for listening to Left of the Projector, and we will catch you next week.